All right, I'm going to load up the live thing. I have the Restream chat app up so I can see live comments.
Yeah, it says we're live now.
It does. We are live, I guess, because I've already loaded that in. We don't have to do that again.
Nope.
Yeah, so we're live, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, that's great. I didn't know we were going right away. So
I
there we
didn't,
go.
but here we are.
We are live, I guess, as a surprise to us.
Yeah.
Which is kind of disappointing because I what did we promise at the end of the last one? We would try better.
We were going to do a better job.
Yeah, we're going to do a better job. And here we are. Yeah. So we're live before we realize it.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know. It says live on my screen. So
yeah. I'm used to it. I'm used to it taking me this other page. And I'm glad you caught that because we could have just been battling here and having no clue. But we're happy to be with you live on our Tuesday, Thursday check-in. I have a glorious coif of hair today, as this is my my social distancing hairdo. I cut the sides, leave the top. It just grows and grows and grows. It's getting long now. I think it's about to here or so. So
I'm like, so here.
Yeah. At the end of this, you and I are going to have the same haircut.
Yep.
That's the long game I'm running in this. Yeah. That's the big reveal on whenever that there's any sort of like you and I are in the same room together. It's the big reveal. There it is. So get some highlights and just
you can do this.
Yeah, that's right. The Amy motions that we're all working out. So at this point, I feel like I do some of those, maybe not to the same extreme, but yeah.
You totally do. The end of the service on Sunday, I said to Addie, "Oh, he did the hands."
Did I? I didn't even realize it. Was it on purpose? It's just, this is what happens when you work with people.
Yeah.
You just start adopting behaviors, hopefully the good ones. So we're happy to be with you. David Warren. Hey, David Warren. I see you're with us. It's good to see you. Hello. Join us live. You got questions to ask us questions. We promise to do better, and we're going to do better. It's just nothing but up here. That was the point of that rough start, is because it's just like, nowhere but up. So we've been asking people to ask questions, submit some questions. We have some humdingers today from a couple different places, and we want to do our best to answer those and just check in with you, see how life is going. You can ask questions there in the chat, but you can also email us questions at questions.hborough.org or questions@hpcnashville.org. Both of those will send it to the same mailbox, which we can check and answer your questions. Couple of things, more live stuff that we have for this week. We have let's see, we got deep dive live tomorrow night, which is we were just talking about that, and we're gonna go like full on scary live tomorrow night, where we're gonna talk to you about this last week's sermon, some other things we're thinking about, just some thoughts. We'll also be able to take your questions at that. That's 6 p.m. tomorrow night on all our different social media feeds. We'll come back to you on Thursday as well for these noon check-ins. And then, of course, our Sunday worship service live stream extravaganzas at 10:30 and 6 p.m. I see some churches that are doing live streams on like every hour. Have you seen this?
No,
it's like 9 a.m., 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 12 a.m., and it's the same thing rebroadcasting. But I do have a friend I spoke to this last week. We have lots of children in our house right now, so if you hear them, I do have a friend. I talked to him this last week, and they are real-time live streaming 2 services every Sunday. So there's doing their early and their late Sunday, just like kind of like a normal Sunday, except all the live streaming stuff. And I was like, that sounds exhausting.
Yes.
And he said yes. And so we exchanged one another wearied glances over Zoom.
Yeah, that would be a lot.
Amy, I believe your grandmother is reaching out to say hello. Is your grandmother Louise?
She is. Hi, Grandma.
Hello, Gail. Gail as well is joining us. Thanks everybody for being here. We're going to jump into some questions here in a second. So, Amy, I'm actually going to ask you because I think this is something that you encountered in your Sunday school to a little, and I'll let you get this ball rolling. So here it is. I'm just going to do my best to read it verbatim. Okay. It says, Jesus stood up to power, to the state, to his own religious leadership, Rome, and Jewish orthodoxy. It was political. He did this through the way he lived, through his unjust suffering, leading to and including the cross, his resurrection. He demonstrates God power over the abuses of temporal powers. So this question asker, I feel at this point, wrote a really good new creed. So
Yes.
they've laid down some really solid theology here. So does turning the other cheek most clearly demonstrate God's instruction to us about the appropriate response to corruption and violence? Good grief. That's a hard question.
Yeah. Do we want to pause right there, maybe?
Yeah, let's pause on that one before we start jumping in, because they don't get any easier.
Yes. Yeah. So this question, like you said, came up during Sunday school. So we were talking about that passage from Acts. This is kind of how the early church is trying to live together post resurrection, right? So the church has formed, and so they're sharing their resources. So just having heard part of the conversation on Friday, I think that's a little bit where this question is coming from, this living together, and how do we live together against or in the midst of corruption and abuse of power and those sorts of things. So this turning the other cheek, and I'm not gonna do this justice, but when I think about that from the gospel, I always remember this is like New Testament class, like very early on at Belmont, where I went to college. I had a professor named Michelle Tooley, and she's passed away now, but she ended up being one of my very favorite professors there. And so she talked about the idea of turning the other cheek as an act of resistance, actually, instead of kind of this passive, like, let people do things to you. But in her mind, there's the kind of backhanded slap, right? Which is put somebody in a subservient sort of role if you hit them with the back of your hand. But if you then turn the other cheek, if they're hitting you with that same hand, you're forcing them to actually hit you as an equal. Does that make sense? Am I like
Yeah,
saying that?
I've never heard that interpretation before. That is interesting.
Yeah. So the turning the other cheek actually is kind of a stabilizer in the power dynamic there in her mind. And she worked a whole lot in liberation theology, which you and I have talked about before. So really seeing this as an act of like, no, you're not just taking this. This is something that you can do that requires you to be seen as an equal by your oppressors.
Yeah, that is really interesting, especially grounded in liberation theology. Yeah, I think that's the danger we all feel with this, is that this could be such a vehicle for enabling abuse.
Right.
That it's such a difficult passage. I was going to answer it two ways. One of which is I can't help but to compare it with basketball. So like I'm watching right now the Michael Jordan documentary, and one of the episodes, I believe the second or third one, is talking about where Jordan's Bulls are coming up against the bad boy Pistons, who are known as like excessively fouling really hard, being rough with people. And one of the lessons they had to learn was, because at first they got riled up and fought back. The other lesson, what they ended up learning, was by not reacting was demonstrating that they weren't letting them get in their heads. And I think there could be an element to that. Maybe that could be taken too far, but maybe there is some element of turning the other cheek is saying to the oppressor, you can mistreat me, but you're not going to change who I am as a result. And as a Christian, that's a generous, person. I think that's one way. The other one was, and this is just the lens in my mind I tend to view these things, is the challenge to turn the other cheek. There's a difference between interpersonal and systemic causes of suffering. Whereas I think the turn the other cheek probably should not be applied to systemic injustices. It's one thing to someone that you have a pre-existing relationship for that, harmed you. But when that starts becoming systemic, and systemic in two regards, systemic in, whole system-wide cultural levels of injustice, but also systemic in the sense that abusers that continue to abuse. I don't, no one should be locked into never ending abuse as a result of turning the other cheek, because, you only have so many cheeks, and Jesus is not, I don't read any of Jesus's teachings to tell us to intentionally place ourselves in harm's way.
Mhm.
And I think it's helpful to combine with what you said and what I said as a lens to start viewing those things. It still doesn't mean that you're going to arrive at a point where you sort of just triumphantly turn the other cheek, because it's still
Right.
really hard.
Right.
Yeah.
You're still, yeah. I mean, even in Dr. Tully's kind of glimpse into that, you're getting hit twice,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 And the first time you didn't see it coming, but the second time you do see it coming.
Yep.
Maybe. Yeah. Yeah. All right. All right, so here we go. Here's the next one of this. Will our death or imprisonment or other suffering accomplish the changes that are required in order to have that world that God shows us through the teaching of Jesus, a world in which we serve the poor, love our neighbor as ourselves, and all that implies? So is to bring about God's kingdom, is it going to require death or imprisonment or suffering to accomplish those changes?
So, I mean, I would say that life is full of suffering, right? That might not be the means of it, but the byproduct of living, right? That
Hmm.
we will go through these things, and my mind right now is being drawn to empathy, in the ways that we can connect with other people. So I'm not saying this very clearly, but I feel like the intention is not the suffering. Like God is not
Hmm.
setting out to say you must suffer these things so that dot 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 whatever that is.
Yeah.
But I feel like the just part of living is suffering. And then how do we help one another with that? How do we as individuals and as organizations, as church, even really in my mind should be our political systems, how do we serve those who need help with the suffering that they're going through? And like I said, that's one on one, but that's also those kind of systemic things that you're talking about, that those things need to be addressed. But the suffering is not, in my mind, what you must go through, like it has been ordered as some kind of test or anything like that, but just how much empathy can we cultivate within ourselves to then serve other people.
Yeah, I think what the core of the question is getting at is the cost, like analyzing the cost before the venture. And I don't know if that was the intent behind it, but it's I think it is easy to it's easy to see that, particularly as consumers, because we just want to know what the cost of something
Right.
is. Whereas I don't think Jesus operates necessarily in that way. So this is the assumption I built. Like this is the assumption I build into my mind whenever I hear questions like this: is if Jesus didn't show up back then but showed up now, I think the end result's the same.
Mhm,
He's not going to die on a cross, but he's going to die on something,
mhm.
and it just matters how fast or in the manner it happens. Really just sort of imagines, I mean, it depends on what country he was born in, really. And I don't think even the most just countries in the world, I do think it's going to end up in many ways the same way. That we're certainly more just in some ways by the advent of jurisprudence and the way we understand it, but I really don't think Jesus would come back with the universal claim in the same way, because there's just too many powered interest in the way of that sort of crazy way of living Jesus is calling us to. But that being said, I think the imitation of Jesus might lead to those same paths, but that's not meaning that those things are required. It's
Right.
just sort of, you throw snow in the wind's going to blow the snow. If you act justly in an unjust world, at some point the unjustness is going to take a bite out of you.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's required. I think maybe also in that question is we're all willing to pay some degree of price provided we get a certain end result. And the problem is there's no guaranteed end result until the return of Christ. And And so that's the real challenge with the church, which is I think the New Testament focuses so much on perseverance, because perseverance is not as concerned with what's going to happen in the end. It's more about being faithful in the moment. And that's sort of our challenge. It's like, suffering will happen. Are you faithful? You have this opportunity before you to be gracious. Will you be faithful? And that's kind of, I think, maybe a better way of getting at it than necessarily asking the cost.
Mm-hmm. So that brings up a little bit what we did talk about in my Sunday school class, honestly, because the story from Acts, you have, that these followers devoted themselves to these things, the breaking of bread, the prayers,
Mm-hmm.
fellowship, the sharing, all of those things they devoted themselves to. And one of the things that we talked about was that they were doing those things. They devoted themselves to those things because that was the way they were living out being faithful. And the very last line in our passage from Acts from Sunday said, and the Lord added to their number every day. So it wasn't because of those things that they were doing. It wasn't like God was looking down saying, like, how well are they saying their prayers right now? It was like a partnership between the folks who devote themselves to living faithfully because it is what they feel called to do. And then God does all the other parts of that. God does the rest of everything else. So it's not that we're checking these things off because they're what is required, right?
Yeah.
We're checking these things off because we each receive the grace of God and the leading of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. I think what's behind a lot of this stuff, and the where we got the question from intimates this too, we're all dealing with some degree of how do we deal with our expectations and our anger. I know our deep dive last week, Aaron talked about some of that. We were talking about, as we begin to move into the next normals of this, what's the reckoning we're going to have to deal with? And his thought was he saw there being lots of just sort of anger, and the anger he saw as being like interpersonal anger between, like, why didn't you call me? Why didn't you connect? Why am I just seeing you now? I also think on top of that, there's a lot of institutional based anger, because we are so polarized that even it's hard to even agree on set facts. It's hard to agree because we can't agree on set facts. It's hard to agree on set plans of action. And beyond that, what we know about our moral reasoning, even if we could agree on those things, it doesn't necessarily mean we would do it. And because of that, we have to deal with all of this sort of latent anger with people that are making decisions for us that we don't have the ability. We just have no control. It's a sense of powerlessness. I mean, I admit that. I mean, I have an enormous sense of powerlessness right now. And so I've had to untwitter myself on a couple of occasions because I get so frustrated. And then I think the problem with social media is you might get frustrated with the decision someone else is making on your behalf. And then you can see that magnified out on the 8 million terrible hot takes that people are giving on Facebook and Twitter. And I wonder if that just generates this enormous sense of anger that we have to learn how to deal with, because one can't help but feel like we are hypocrites in that, because as Christians in this day and age, we've never developed a helpful model of how to deal with our anger.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me of Deep Dive 2 weeks ago when we were talking to Dr. Beth Baxter, and she was talking about that agency. What is our agency during this time? And so being able to frame those decisions that we can make as, still having power within what we're doing now. But I absolutely 100% hear what you're saying. And I feel those things too, that sense of powerlessness. I'm emailing all the time, all the government officials. I mean, all the time, both local, federal.
Yeah. It's, I think I was speaking with one of our leaders today in a conversation, and we were talking about something, and I think this might be a helpful framing. This is not, what I'm about to say is not going to make anyone's life any easier, but maybe it makes it a little more faithful. So, okay. I apologize if I muck this up, but One of the big challenges right now is because we live in a polarized society. You would say progressives, liberals, conservatives, fundamentalists, whatever the language we want to call ourselves, people end up on these polls. It's really tempting to say one is a moderate. Okay. So one could argue that anyone on these polls is beholden to an ideology. So, a more conservative would be free market capitalism, whereas a liberal would be more social services, whatever, and you would say, I believe in these as ideologies. Or, the big one we're going through right now is how do we find the careful balance between one end, conservatives that tend to be much more concerned with personal liberty, and right now with more progressives that seem to be much more concerned with public health. There's all these polarizations. Well, what a moderate does is simply looks at the polls and then chooses a spot in the middle. And so if we understand if that's what a moderate is, that's not an ideology. You're just picking a point in the middle. And so 20 years from now, let's say those polls shift, because they're always shifting. Well, a moderate position is going to shift, but not because of some core basis of beliefs. It's just because they're choosing a place in the middle. Mm-hmm. And so to me, how this relates to this conversation is, I think it's really easy as Christians to get caught in this loop. Like, we think we need to be moderate. And on top of that, we need to never be angry. And it creates this inner voice that's just constantly telling us, don't be mad, don't be frustrated, don't take extreme positions, don't do any of these things, because that's like getting out on a limb on something which we shouldn't be doing. Mm-hmm. And it causes, to me, I think that causes a lot of anxiety in people, because I think there at times you do feel anger, and it is righteous anger. Jesus knocked people out of a synagogue, or out of the temple. I mean, yep. He knocked people out of this, and he called one of his own disciples Satan. I mean, Jesus is not someone known for parsing words. That's one of the things I was struck by, is the way we did our Holy Week this week. Is Jesus comes in on this triumphal entry and then just proceeds to just do inflammatory thing after inflammatory thing. Now, he's not doing it for the sake of it. He's speaking truth. So he's not doing it just for the sake of being inflaming, but he's still doing stuff that if Jesus were a moderate, he wouldn't have done. Mm-hmm. Because he just would have said, here are these polls. I'm going to find a safe place in the middle. I shouldn't be angry. I'm going to always be forgiving, always be forgiving, always be angry. And I think that's helpful to remind yourself at this time, is that it's like, it is really hard, but just because you're angry doesn't mean you're wrong. It's what's the scripture says is, be angry, but do not sin. So the state of anger is not sin. It is what one does with that anger. And so if you are angry with the situation, which leads you to write a letter to a legislator, that's not sinning. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It gets messy going much further into this, but I think that's a helpful framing, is that just merely choosing moderate positions is not choosing an ideology. You're just choosing a point between two extremes. And in the same regard, if you're always just telling yourself as a Christian, you can't be angry, you can't have that frustration. I appreciate people that are angry and wrestle with it, as opposed to people that just act like everything's okay. And I think that's a skill we really need to work on this time, because there's no way we emerge from this without some degree of anger.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me wish, because the pictures that we usually put on the wall of Jesus, or, he's holding the lamb as the good shepherd, the Sunday, mm-hmm. good Shepherd Sunday, or in the laughing Jesus that came out, several years ago now.
Yeah.
I wish we had, some that were up of him knocking those tables over in the temple, because it's one of my favorite stories, because it's doing everything that you're talking about now, because that is a model for us. And I love the righteous anger, and that doesn't mean that you necessarily go out, just shaking your finger at everything, but being thoughtful about how the ways that we respond when we see injustice. And yeah, I could go on and on about that. I'll just pause right there.
Yeah. And it's helpful to know, particularly within, it's easy to look in our own American history of this, of, the most common critique of Martin Luther King was he as a disruptor, his anger as being a disruptive tool. And I don't want to over idealize every aspect of these things, but
Yeah.
it is helpful to know that calling someone angry or calling someone disruptive is the easiest criticism, because it works if our orientation is just towards moderates. If
Right.
our orientation is just to be a moderate, we are never going to be comfortable with people that are trying to speak truth to power. In fact, that's why in everyone should read it. Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail is just a screed against Christian moderates. So I'm not calling us today to any particular extreme position. I'm just more calling us to a realization that as we're journeying through this, that just finding a point in the middle of extremes is not actually choosing a theology or a belief or how we think we should faithfully respond. It's just choosing a middle path. Which again, I want to say is not the same thing as compromise.
Hmm.
Compromise is two parties working something out what they can mutually agree on. Being a moderate is not compromise. You're just choosing the milk toast middle road.
Yeah.
And that's a complicated thing, because no one wants to be accused of being political or polarized. But I don't know. I also think that would be probably the thing Jesus gets accused of in this day and age. He'd be, they try to put him into one camp even though he doesn't fit there.
Hmm.
Yeah. It's
Absolutely.
challenging.
Yep.
Yeah. See what happens when you ask dangerous questions,
Right.
David. If you got any other questions, throw them in there. We see some people joining along in the conversation here. Yeah, it does say Jesus says, "Don't be angry, but do not sin." That's the real challenge in all of this. How can we still have an attitude of grace towards others in the midst of calling them out? I think about that with the prophet Jeremiah all the time, because if I imagine of all the prophets speak out against injustice. He just seems to be the one that has the most fire in his belly about it. And I've often wondered, how is he doing this in a way that still looks for grace? Because he's like all grace or all condemnation at any given point. He's like a fire hose in that regard. It's just all on. Yeah. Well, if you got any questions, type them there. Other than that, we're happy to check in with you. I know a lot of you all are without power. It's kind of wild. Amy, you were without power, weren't you?
Yep. On
Yeah.
Sunday. Now we didn't lose power last night, and
Okay.
the part of Nashville where I live, there were a lot of folks who lost power again, but we didn't last night.
Yeah, I saw some of the weather thing I follow on Twitter just said something like, once in 100-year tornado or whatever, comes through, and in exactly 2 months to the date it comes through with another derecho, and then the storm behind it causes damage is very, what do they say? It's very on brand for 2020.
Yes.
This is
Oh,
just
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, and so here in Nashville, I believe it was on Saturday. It was the 10-year anniversary since the flood that hit the city too. So
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I see Sherry was responding to our conversation about moderates. I think you're right on the nose there. That it depends on what I'm talking about. Moderate is talking about sort of more our inner dialogue, not necessarily political moderates. Although that our sort of inner moderation can have political impact, because I think it's also easy within the Christian world to say, I don't want to be involved in the messiness of politics. They should just work out a compromise. And I think that's kind of an easy position as Christians to take, because it's the least controversial. But when I talk about moderate, what I'm more referring to is one's inner, how one tries to discern issues, which is real. I think a lot of what happens is it is uncomfortable to take difficult positions, and that's a reality within the church, within polarization. And I'm not expressing what I'm about to express any political view, other than to express a way to get at this is, and I think Sherry was getting on some of this, is that if we are as Christians to say one was on the side of life, it means we have to find a different way to have a conversation about issues of gun control, mass incarceration, capital punishment, and abortion. We need to have different ways of having those conversations than the way they are currently constructed. And because one could see a degree of hypocrisy within both parties in their response to those answers. And so I'm not saying that to express necessarily my opinion on that, but I think it is fair to say in the outlines, particularly those discussions, that there is not a lot of necessarily integrity to every answer in those, in the way we are political polarized. Again, I think that's a way of getting at some of this. It's hard. I don't have the answers on these things. I mean, ultimately people vote, and unfortunately for our nightmare of a political system right now, you get two choices, and at least two realistic choices. Which is why a lot of states are having a movement towards something called ranked choice voting, which is something I'd encourage you to look at. Really interesting. It's where you don't just vote for one person, particularly on lower level things. You can actually rank your order of choice, which is interesting. A lot of interesting thoughts about that out right now. But it's hard. The moderate thing, I really do want to say, it's more about an internal orientation. And I think it's often a response to the discomfort one feels when they start getting into a place where they feel like they're taking a position that they might believe in, but have a hard time expressing it or putting it into action. And so the easy way out of that's just to try to find a place in the middle. It's hard. It's hard. I don't envy any of us to do that, particularly because tribalism creates purity tests, agree with me on everything or else you're my enemy. And that's an awful place to be in.
And this reminds me of conversations we've had multiple times now in the last couple of months about social media and kind of being involved in these kinds of conversations over social media, like where you're just posting something that you think, and it's just out there and it can hit people, maybe not even the way that you've intended, but all of a sudden there's this animosity that doesn't lead anywhere. Like
you're right.
These are not conversations that go to a place. Like reconciliation is not a lot of times even the goal of, posting what you think about an issue, a topic, whatever you're wanting your opinion to be known about. It's not a space that usually is inviting true and earnest conversation with one another.
Yeah. And so much of these issues are so specific to specific actions, meaning, we create all these debates in the abstract and then we scream about them across the void.
Correct.
Yeah. I tend to see sometimes as Facebook and social media just as venting, which is why I post, maybe once a month on Facebook, and I posted something this last week, and it was basically just, I said, I'm screaming into the void and I'm complaining about the number of motorcycles and cars with bass, really loud bass driving in our neighborhood. And I realized I'm screaming that into the void. The void screamed back to me on that one. Yeah. largely agreeing, but yeah, it's hard. It's funny that our social media in some ways might be a way we're trying to manage our anxiety by just sort of venting and interacting, but it ends up magnifying it and then sending it right back to us, which is so frustrating.
Right. It makes you want to just throw your hands up. Like, okay.
Yeah. Well, we've been all over the place in this conversation. Hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully we didn't confuse you more, or if we did confuse you, it leads to a holy searching that arrives at a better place for you. I don't know. I can't prescribe that for you. But thanks for joining us, checking in. You can always check in with us, call us at the church, email me. It's go to our website, hborough.org. You can get all that information there. We'll answer questions at hborough.org. We're going to be back tomorrow evening with our deep dive, where we talk a little bit more about the theme specifically we are dealing with, in worship. We've been having guests on the last couple of weeks. We don't have a guest lined up this week. We might end up having one, but we're going no strings attached live on Wednesday. So we have a lot more room for interaction at 6 p.m. on Wednesday night. And so, thank you, David. So yes, thanks for joining us. And I don't know what else to say. We tried to do better. I don't know if we did better today, but we tried.
I love the surprise, intro, we're live, and here we are.
Here we are. I promise you, to the best of our ability, tomorrow night at Deep Dive at 6 p.m. is we'll be about as professional as we can muster. So no.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think you and I may need to start our call at 4 o'clock. So we're ready by the time it rolls around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, y'all. Take care. Stay safe. It's just, we feel like we're in a never ending loop of, if it's one thing after another here in Nashville. And so I pray that you can have a good nap today, or curl up with a good book and get out of that feeling. So take care, everyone.